Thank you very much, David, for joining us for this episode of Policy Gone Viral. We appreciate you taking some time out of your schedule to talk about an analysis that I think all Floridians should be paying attention to, particularly those that are candidates for office that are running statewide. First off, kind of diving in, what was the genesis of trying to kind of parse out this data, and why is it important for Floridians, especially those running?
Right. Well, there has been a tendency among prominent Republicans, and when I say that, I mean the most prominent, Senator Mitch McConnell, the Senate Republican leader, and President Trump, of course, to treat the issue of Puerto Rican status or statehood as some kind of democratic ploy in order to, it's just a cynical ploy in order to get extra representation in Congress. Now, aside from the fact that Puerto Rico sends one person to Congress, who happens to be a Republican, it's actually a kind of important thing to understand that the politics surrounding Puerto Rican status and statehood are not really like that at all. And that in fact, the people who tend to oppose it are very far left socialists, and that the people who tend to support it are precisely those Puerto Rican voters most likely to vote Republican. So, okay, but why does it matter? Most people, maybe most Americans could say they've never been to Puerto Rico. I have just once. Very recently, Florida, okay, you may wonder, why does this matter? And the reason it matters for politicians who maybe aren't in Puerto Rico or don't go to Puerto Rico is that Florida has just surpassed New York as the state with the greatest number of Puerto Ricans in the mainland. And obviously, unlike New York, Florida is an extremely competitive political state. It's one that you cannot win the presidency without, especially if you're a Republican. And so you have to understand this issue because, and as the data that we have, that we've been able to work through in this analysis shows, it's an issue that matters to Puerto Ricans on the mainland. And it is an issue that, depending on a candidate's attitude toward this, it could be the difference of whether they're willing to consider voting for him, whichever party he or she happens to belong to.
Well, and you touch on a point that I think I'd like to unpack a little bit more, being that, Florida is probably the single biggest swing state in a federal election, and our demographics are incredibly diverse, and as a result, our elections are very close. So can you speak a little bit to kind of how that kind of ties into the analysis and why this kind of a cohort of the voting population becomes so critical?
Right. Well, there is a simplistic way of looking at elections that simply says, well, you don't need to bother with that group of people. You're never going to do well with them. Or you don't need to talk to, if you're a Republican, you don't need to worry so much about evangelicals. They're going to vote for you no matter what. But that's really not how elections work. What really happens in an election is that you need to get the largest possible margin you can with the constituencies that tend to support you, and you need to shrink your opponent's margins with groups that tend to vote for him. So, as a Republican, getting only 80% of the evangelical vote might not be enough for you to win an election ever. You might need to get at least 85%. And if you're a Democrat, getting only 85% of the black vote could be curtains for your campaign, whereas, you are expected to get 90 or 95%. Well, with Puerto Ricans, we're looking at a constituency that's sort of in between there, right? Where they are certainly a Democratic constituency, albeit one that has very conservative attitudes on certain things. But we're looking at a key demographic group where Republicans, if they want to win the presidency, are going to have to do better on the margins. They occupy in large numbers a part of the state of Florida that is critical to winning Florida. And we identify 12 counties in particular, where if you add up the total aggregate vote in those 12 counties and basically compare it to recent elections, you realize that the Republicans who win the aggregate vote in those 12 counties, President Trump won it with 50.2% in that part of Florida, whereas Mitt Romney had 49.8%. Now, I don't want to, and this also look at, for example, the of Governor DeSantis, But if you, I don't want to put too much weight on that, but you can clearly see that this is a part of the state that is absolutely critical. It is filled with Puerto Rican voters. If you're going to win Florida, you got to win there, and you appeal to them. You don't have to win majorities, but you have to do better among them than than expected. You have to take their concerns seriously and go to them and appeal to them. And like you said, demographics matter. You have a very diverse electorate down there, and you have to try to appeal a little bit to everybody.
So looking at the data, David, you kind of already mentioned a few key findings, but are there any others that you want to highlight for our viewers or our listeners?
Right. Well, I think it's important to say, for one thing, that people might just assume that Puerto Ricans who come to the U.S. To the U.S. mainland, Puerto Rico is in the United States, but Puerto Ricans who live on the mainland, that they stop caring so much about Puerto Rico, and that's absolutely untrue. In fact, our findings, looking at the data available, was that over time, the belief that the status issue in Puerto Rico is important among Florida Puerto Ricans has only become, it has gotten bigger, right? That between extremely important and very important, the number has increased between 2014 and 2017 to 85% who think that it's either extremely important or very important. So clearly, this is an issue that the people who came here care about. Now, I think it's important to understand a little more context about this. Puerto Rico has been losing population, and it has been falling behind. I believe that either it fell behind Utah or it's about to fall behind Utah by the next census, because there has been, the feeling among one of the lines that one of the political scientists says is that Puerto Ricans are choosing statehood with their feet. They're moving to states. And a lot of them feel that the island's problems, and this was another one of the findings, right? The common perception that Puerto Rico's problems have to do with, among other things, the uncertainty involved in not having statehood status. Now, so if you think of it that way, what you realize is that the most pro-statehood Puerto Ricans are the ones who live on the U.S. mainland, in places like Florida especially. They came here, they feel like they're not getting the piece of the American dream that they deserve perhaps back in Puerto Rico, but they really want to see things change back there. Now, what eventually, when you tease out all of the numbers, what you realize is that, first of all, yes, that these voters are more likely to vote for a candidate who wants Puerto Rico to be the 51st state. Now, first of all, there was a rating scale of 1 to 10, and the 8.1 ended up being the number. So this is definitely an issue where Puerto Rican voters surveyed felt very much like someone who takes this position, I would be more likely to vote for them for Congress, regardless of which party they're in. But the other thing that you have to think about as a Republican, and this is sort of where we tease this out in the analysis, is that the Puerto Rican voter who is most likely to vote Republican is going to be an advocate for statehood. And that's maybe the key thing, right? You have to think about how, which voters are going to be persuadable from a Republican perspective. And if you think about it, this makes sense. If you understand much about politics within Puerto Rico, the center-right party is the one that supports statehood. The left-wing party is the one that kind of plays with independence, but talks about Commonwealth status, and it can be very confusing to follow for a mainlander. But the important thing here is that if you're a Republican and you're trying to collect as many Puerto Rican votes as you possibly can in Florida, you are going to be appealing to the statehood people, the pro-statehood people. And if you disparage their cause and you say, oh, this is just a Democratic trick to get extra senators, you're kind of writing them off, and it's not a good idea.
And so you just kind of hinted at it, but just to wrap it all up, those running for statewide or federal office, what should they really be taking away from this and your research?
Yeah, well, look, I'm not telling anyone to adopt an insincere position and something they don't believe in or don't care about much. But just approach the issue with some respect and some perspective, you know? Don't write it off. It was kind of funny when President Trump he got into a little back and forth with the mayor of San Juan and said something about how Puerto Rico couldn't handle statehood because of how incompetently it was being governed. But he was actually in a back and forth with an ardent opponent of statehood. And this is what, you know, this is part of what people need to understand. Puerto Ricans feel like, a lot of them do, and you know, a very large number feel that they could actually govern themselves a lot better if they were a state. And just respect the perspective. You know, you don't have to jump into this issue and become some kind, you know, it would be a little bit artificial for a lot of politicians, but respect the perspective. Look at what do Puerto Ricans want? That's one of the issues that, you know, a politician who is willing to respect the will of the voters in Puerto Rico, I think that gets you a long ways toward where you need to be as someone who can command the respect and win more votes from Floridian Puerto Rican voters who do so much to, you know, who will do so much to determine the outcome in future elections in Florida.
Absolutely. Well, David, thanks so much for joining us again for this episode. We really appreciate all your research on this and the analysis. For folks that are watching or listening, you can read David's report at jamesmadison.org, and we'll catch you for another episode next time.